Did God change His mind on which day we should observe His Sabbath? Genesis chapter 2 tells us that God blessed, He sanctified, and He rested on the seventh day of creation week. We know that when Israel came out of Egyptian slavery, God taught them to worship Him on the seventh day of the week. We even are told that one of the reasons that Israel lost their access to the Promised Land was because of Sabbath breaking. But most Christians today worship on Sunday. That's the first day of the week. Do you know why? The Bible is very clear. We are to worship God on His Sabbath, which is the seventh day of the week. So if you're worshiping on Sunday, the first day of the week, you're worshiping on the wrong day. Now that's a big claim, I know, but I can prove it. Let's look at who tried to change the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday, and more importantly, why God rejects that change. Let's first look at the example of Jesus Christ, the Son of God in the flesh. How did He approach keeping the Sabbath holy? In the New Testament, the New King James Version uses the word Sabbath 60 times. Nearly half of those uses are Him in conflict with the religious authorities of His day, arguments about the Sabbath. Now, many people will claim that in these conflicts, Jesus was saying that the Sabbath isn't sacred anymore, that God doesn't expect us to observe it anymore. However, a closer read will show you that He was in conflict with how the Sabbath was observed, but never when the Sabbath was observed. Let's look at the example of Jesus Christ. Let's start in Luke chapter 4 and in verse 16. We see here that it says, "So He came to Nazareth, where He had been brought up, and as His custom was, He went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read." While Jesus was on this earth, as His custom was, Jesus kept the commandments and observed the Sabbath. But did Jesus observe the Sabbath for us? Did He do it so we don't have to anymore? Some believe and teach that He came to remove the burden of the 10 Commandments, nailing them to the cross. But what's really interesting about that argument, though, is most people believe in 9 out of the 10 Commandments. Few Christians would make an argument that says, well, we can kill whenever we like, we can lie whenever we want, or we can commit adultery whenever we want. No, the only commandment that really disappears in that argument is the Sabbath commandment. But let's look at what Jesus told His disciples. In Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 17, He says this, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled." Have heaven and earth passed away yet? Not yet. And notice He didn't mention that He would be fulfilling the law through His death. There's still a lot more of God's plan that hasn't yet been fulfilled. In fact, Jesus emphasized His authority over how the Sabbath should be observed. In Mark chapter 2, starting in verse 27, we read the following, "And He said to them," to His disciples, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." As the Creator Himself, He was the best one to explain how the Sabbath should be observed. Why would Jesus bother saying this if He didn't intend for His followers to keep the Sabbath as well? And speaking of His followers, did they continue to observe the Sabbath, or did they change it? After Jesus' death and resurrection, we also see that it was Paul's custom to keep the Sabbath. Acts chapter 17, starting in verse 2, it says, "And then Paul, as his custom was, went in to them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures." We also see from this chapter that many were converted, including Greeks in Thessalonica. Later on in Antioch, he also preached on the Sabbath day, and after he was done, it says that the Gentiles from that city begged him to return the following Sabbath to preach to them. And it's recorded in Acts chapter 13, in verse 44, on the next Sabbath, almost the whole city came together to hear the word of God. The whole city would have included both Jews and Greeks. So what do we see? For Jesus and for his immediate disciples, the Sabbath was still God's sacred day of rest. But something changed. Paul, whose custom it was to keep the Sabbath, knew that changes were coming, and he gave this ominous warning to a young minister named Timothy. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3, it says, "For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers, and they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables." A fable was a Greek narrative or story. Paul warned Timothy that fables, myths, false narratives would start to infiltrate the church after his death. Looking back through history, historians can point to significant changes in what the first century church was and what it later became. In his book, Ecclesiastical Researches, Robert Robinson says the following about this time in the church. Toward the latter end of the second century, most of the churches assumed a new form. The first simplicity had disappeared. And, he says, insensibly as the old disciples retired to their graves, their children, along with new converts, both Jews and Gentiles, came forward and new modeled the cause. The narrative had already started to change. But the question is, was God happy with that change? As time went on, and as the disciples who knew Jesus directly began to die off, something began to shift in the church. And by the time we get to the 4th century, we discovered that the Church of Rome was making several significant changes at various councils. But after the apostles died, and before these changes in the 300s, what happened? Did the early church abandon the Sabbath in deference to Sunday? Modern scholarship can help us look back at that long history and try and piece together what was happening at this time. I'd like to look at 3 quotes today from different historians who wrote about this period of time between the death of the apostles and the 300s. The first is a direct quote from Clement of Alexandria. He's an ante-Nicene church leader writing around AD 194. Here's what he says. "But the 7th day is recognized as sacred, not by the Hebrews only, but also by the Greeks." So according to Clement, who was alive at the end of the 2nd century, the Sabbath was still in place, and the Christian church, observed by both Jews and Greeks, kept the Sabbath. If Paul and John had made a change, why would Clement say that the church at this time still honored the Sabbath? The second quote is by August Neander. Quoting from his History of the Christian Religion and Church, he writes, "The festival of Sunday, like all other festivals, was always only a human ordinance, and it was far from the intention of the apostles to establish a divine command in this respect. Far from them and from the early apostolic church to transfer the laws of the Sabbath to Sunday." But then he adds an interesting point. "Perhaps at the end of the 2nd century, a false application of this kind had begun to take place, for men appear by that time to have considered laboring on Sunday as a sin." Finally, the third quote. Let's read a quote from Johann von Mosheim, a Lutheran minister. He writes, "The Christians of this century assembled on the 1st day of the week, for that this day was set apart for religious worship by the apostles themselves, and that, after the example of the Church of Jerusalem, it was generally observed, we have unexceptionable testimony." Well, who's right? Clement, who lived during that period of time, said that the Christian church was still observing the Sabbath. Neander tells us that the early apostolic church had no inkling of Sunday being a day of worship. Or Mosheim, who says the apostles and the 1st century church in Jerusalem had already changed it. What a confusing mess. Let's look at what actually happened and when. As we've already seen in the pages of the New Testament, the early church continued to keep the Sabbath. We also know that the author of the Epistle to the Hebrews tells us something very important. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 9, and I'm going to quote this from the New American Standard Bible. It says, "So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God." The Greek word for Sabbath rest is sabbatismos. It's a word that literally means a keeping of the Sabbath. How did Christianity go from keeping the Sabbath to observing Sunday? After the death of the apostles, the church maintained much of the same religious practices, including the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath. However, by the 300s, things changed dramatically for Christianity in the Roman Empire. Enter Emperor Constantine. By the 300s, Christianity had spread under the rule of the Roman Empire. Coming into Christianity were, of course, Jewish converts, but also Greek and Roman converts. And each group brought with them some of the ideas from their former religious beliefs. Emperor Constantine began his life as a pagan, as he is quoted in several places saying that he observed the venerable day of the sun, Sunday. In AD 312, while marching on Rome to defeat Maxentius and take total rule over the empire, Constantine supposedly saw the Chi-Rho symbol, the first two letters of the Greek word for Christ. Some believed that it was a symbol of Christ, shining in the sky along with the words in Latin, "By this sign conquer." He won this battle, and he credited Christ with that victory. He now saw Christianity as a way to unite the Roman Empire under one religion. So his rule now shifted toward Christianity. But the church at that time was divided on several issues. Were Christians supposed to retain Jewish laws, or were they a different group now than a sect of the Jews? Would the empire have to remove the pagan practices that they had kept for centuries? Or could they keep those pagan practices, but do them under a Christian banner? To settle these questions, Constantine convened a series of councils to get to a systematic teaching of Christianity. On March 7th, 321 AD, Constantine issued a civil decree in the Edict of Constantine, in which he says, "On the venerable day of the sun, Sunday, let the magistrates and people residing in cities rest, and let all workshops be closed. In the country, however, persons engaged in agriculture may freely and lawfully continue their pursuits, because it often happens that another day is not so suitable for grain sowing or vine planting, lest by neglecting the proper moment for such operations, the bounty of heaven should be lost." Now, this law initially wasn't aimed at replacing the Sabbath with Sunday, but it did establish a day of rest on the day of the sun, or Sunday. And sun worshipers, like he had been, now had a day of rest. But what that did do was pave the way for pagans who were converting to Christianity to keep their old day of worship in honor of their new Christian God. I want you to notice how Eusebius, who by the way was a contemporary of Constantine, felt about Sunday. In his commentary on the Psalms, he says, "On this day, which is the first of light and of the true sun, we assemble after an interval of 6 days and celebrate the holy and spiritual Sabbaths. And all things whatsoever that was duty to do on the Sabbath, these we have transferred to the Lord's day, as more appropriately belonging to it, because it has a precedence and is first in rank and more honorable than the Jewish Sabbath." In other words, Eusebius clearly shows us that this change was something that was decided upon by humans. But who were Eusebius and Constantine to make these changes anyway? By what authority did they authorize this shift? Interestingly, after Constantine died, many Christians reverted back to keeping the Sabbath, especially in the East. To counter this, those that followed Constantine had another meeting, which was held in 365 AD, called the Council of Laodicea. Canon 29 of that council states the following: Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, but must work on that day, rather honoring the Lord's Day, and if they can, resting then as Christians. But if any shall be found to be Judaizers, let them be anathema from Christ. Unfortunately, to Constantine and many others that followed him, to do anything like the Jews did was abhorrent, and therefore was not to be tolerated. The progression from Sabbath to Sunday can be summed up this way. Jesus and the apostles kept the Sabbath according to God's ordained time of worship. The early church kept the Sabbath as they were taught by the apostles. Paul warned fables would enter the church and changes would start to occur. We know that the Sabbath was strictly kept in the 2nd century, but some Christians chose to honor Sunday as a celebration of Jesus' resurrection from the dead, even though Christ never commanded that to be done. Slowly, but surely, the 2 days were both observed together. The Sabbath as a day of rest, and Sunday as a day of celebration. Here's how Lyman Coleman described this period of time and this change in his book, Ancient Christianity Exemplified. I think you'll find this interesting. He says, the observance of the Lord's Day, Sunday, was ordered, while yet the Sabbath of the Jews was continued. Nor was the latter, the Sabbath, superseded until the former, Sunday, had acquired the same solemnity and importance, which belonged at first to that great day which God originally ordained and blessed. But in time, after the Lord's Day was fully established, the observance of the Sabbath of the Jews was gradually discontinued and finally was denounced as heretical. Isn't that amazing how the change went from keeping the Sabbath so diligently to having it being called the Sabbath of the Jews, which it never was, and finally to be denounced altogether? But was this of God's doing? Did He honor this change? We've mainly focused on the New Testament for this episode, but I want to remind all of us of something that God taught ancient Israel about the mixing of the religion that He gave them with the religion of others. Deuteronomy chapter 12 discusses this, and in verse 30, it says, "Do not inquire after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? I will also do likewise. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. Whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. You shall not add to it, nor take away from it." You know, for the Church of Rome to adopt the pagan day of the sun to replace the Sabbath was doing exactly what God told Israel never to do. And so that's how Constantine's venerable day of the sun came to be so prominent in modern Christianity, and how we can know that Christ was never the source of any of these changes. But I know we haven't answered every question that you might have about this complicated issue. I can hear some of you right now saying, but what about Colossians 2:16 and 17? Didn't Paul here clearly tell the church that the Sabbath was just a Jewish festival, but the substance was Christ? What about John being in the Spirit on the Lord's Day? These are big questions that we don't have time to tackle today, but we do answer them in a booklet that you can download for free from our website. It's titled The Sabbath, a Neglected Gift from God. It contains all of the verses that people used to say that the early church changed from Sabbath to Sunday. And it gives a clear contextual understanding of what was actually written. This book includes some very helpful sections, like what happened on the first day of the week. There are many scriptures that discuss the first day of the week. What do they mean? Another section, answers to the objections to the Sabbath. Many people think that the Apostle Paul or others changed from Sabbath to Sunday. What are those scriptures and how can we explain them? A next section, the early church and the Sabbath, which we discussed a lot about today. And it finally concludes with an extremely helpful section, when and how to keep God's Sabbath. The answers to your questions about the Sabbath are in the pages of your Bible. Please take the time and the challenge to look up each one of these for yourself. You will find a truth that you may have never been taught before, one that will change the way you study God's Word. I'm Phil Sandilands. Thank you for sharing your time with me on this episode of Life, Hope, and Truth Presents. Thanks for watching. We hope this episode is useful to you. Our mission is to preach exactly what the Bible says. The message of the Bible will clear up any questions you might have about what your purpose is, who God is, what He's trying to do, and it can transform your life.